So I wonder, you're obviously very well traveled. You've been to a lot of countries. We are sort of raised in this society, in American society, to see ourselves as the most open, the freest, the most democratic society in the history of the universe, right? Are we? What is your sense, based on what you see in terms of access to information and civic involvement by citizens? How do we measure, just anecdotally, based on your experiences, to other countries?
I mean, I think it depends who you are, what sector of society you live in. In the United States, we are the freest country on earth for some. But for others, it's a very frightening place. And that's particularly for people without means. For example, when it comes to issues of police brutality, you could say that, you can walk down the streets of New York freely, and that is a wonderful thing. And you see police around, you feel safe. That's for one sector of society, a white, wealthier sector of society. But for those who are black and brown in New York, to see police is a very frightening image. Instead of the wave of relief one might feel, oh, there's someone here guaranteeing my security. For others, that very person dressed in blue, whatever the color of their skin, might be the greatest threat to them. Hundreds of thousands of young black and brown young men and some women have been stopped time and time again by the police, stopped and frisked. And it's dependent on who you are in this society, the level of freedom you experience.
I'm not sure if you've had an opportunity to read it yet, but Matt Taibbi, his most recent book, The Divide, is a really powerful treatise, really, on exactly what you're talking about. I mean, he draws a clear line between how, say, for example, you've got a group of bankers and wealthy businessmen who were directly responsible for defrauding their companies on a massive scale, bringing the world economy to its knees, and not one person has seen jail time or even been prosecuted for it. Meanwhile, you've got, if you happen to be a minority in New York walking down the street, you can get arrested by the police for obstructing pedestrian traffic over and over again, and then get subjected to this arbitrary Kafkaesque judicial system, which makes it harder for people to live and to pull themselves out of poverty. So, yeah. Are you familiar with that book, The Divide?
Extremely, yeah. We interviewed Matt, and I read The Divide, and it's very important because it is showing not only the corruption of Wall Street and its enormous power, that sucking sound from the bottom to the top, the enormous wealth those at the top have accrued, but what happens to everyone else? A kid who's smoking a joint can go to jail for who knows how long. And yet these banks that have profited from narco trafficking and laundering their money, they never see a day in jail. Those that fraudulently threw tens of thousands of people out of their homes in this country, who goes to jail and who doesn't?
Yeah, it's really, as a citizen, it's really infuriating to hear these things because, I'm a young white male person, so I'm the beneficiary of a significant amount of preference and fortune, and it's a privilege. That's the word I'm looking for. And it's, that book in particular really kind of opened my eyes to, not that I was unaware, but to what extent this type of divide is taking place and how inequality factors into it. In any event, I would like to move on a little bit and just talk a little bit about the Obama administration's hostility to journalism. We've got, let's see, the New York Times media correspondent David Carr said, quote, "If you add up the pulling of news organization phone records referring to the Associated Press, the tracking of individual reporters, referring to Fox News, by the Obama administration, and the effort by the current administration to go after sources, 7 instances and counting in which a government official has been criminally charged with leaking classified information to the news media, which is more than all previous administrations combined, suggesting that there is a war on the press is less hyperbole than simple math. What is your take on that?
The Obama administration, right, has gone after more whistleblowers than all administrations combined, and this is something that has to be repeated over and over again. Why? The Obama administration promised President Obama to close Guantanamo, first order of business when he became president. It's now 5-6 years later. It's not closed. Now, the Republicans certainly helped prevent it from being closed, but immigration, the administration has hit that landmark of 2 million people deported, more than any president in U.S. history. Why is this? And as all of these gruesome landmarks are being passed, the administration is becoming increasingly secretive, even though President Obama said we will be the most transparent in history, our administration. Journalists are being targeted. I have spent a good deal of time with Glenn Greenwald recently. He and Laura Poitras are the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalists, now Pulitzer Prize-winning journalists, who met with Edward Snowden in Hong Kong and got the documents and continue to release stories based on those documents of this NSA contractor who was deeply concerned that he, a 29-year-old high school dropout, Edward Snowden, I'm talking about, could read the emails of the President of the United States. Of course, the administration immediately said he's not telling the truth, which is why he needed the documents to back up what he was saying. And Laura and Glenn were concerned about coming into the United States over the past year, that they could be arrested themselves. When you had people like the House Intelligence Chair, Mike Rogers, who will now leave the House to become a radio talk show host, saying that people like Glenn Greenwald should be arrested. This is of grave concern. They were concerned they'd be arrested in this country, that they'd be subpoenaed in this country, but they did come back in order to pick up their George Polk Awards. Those are some of the highest awards in journalism. And then a few days later, the announcement of the Pulitzer Prize for their work in both the Washington Post and the Guardian newspapers. So you have some examples of crusading journalists who are doing such important work and putting their liberty on the line. I mean, James Risen is, continuing to fight this battle around handing over information about his source on warrantless wiretapping. It's all unacceptable, and it's happening under the Obama administration, which might surprise many of his supporters.
Yeah, well, this kind of goes back a little bit to the divide that Matt Taibbi was writing about as well, where what does it say about our country when the president's administration is pursuing the leakers, the whistleblowers, and the news reporters more actively than they're pursuing the people who have potentially broken laws and violated our constitutional rights?
Repeat that question, Eric.
So it seems to point to this divide where the administration and the government is pursuing the leakers and the whistleblowers with more vigor, and the journalists who have exposed wrongdoing with more vigor than they're exposing the actual wrongdoers, the people who are...
they're protecting themselves. These journalists are exposing government corruption, fraud, surveillance, and the government understandably doesn't like that, but that doesn't give them the right to prosecute these people. It's not just journalists, it's people in the highest levels of the National Security Agency who joined decades ago to protect the American people and find that they're simply spying on the American people, and they don't like this. They try to expose it, and then they themselves find themselves at with a gun to their heads. No kidding. I'm talking about someone like Bill Binney, who was a national security official, National Security Agency, NSA official, He worked there for decades, deeply concerned about what was happening, and before he knew it, he was in the shower one morning. He's a diabetic amputee, and he had guns to his head. It was the federal authorities who had broken into his house, or, perhaps his son let them in because he saw federal authorities outside, and his wife and his son are frightened. He is, to say the least, frightened. And ultimately, he wasn't prosecuted, but he sure was terrorized. Or take Tom Drake, who was prosecuted. A brilliant guy at the NSA, deeply concerned about what was happening there. Take Jesselyn Radack, who was a Justice Department ethics official, lawyer, who now is representing all these whistleblowers. And she and Ray McGovern, who's a former CIA briefer for George H.W. Bush, Tom Drake and others went to Russia to award Edward Snowden a major prize for what he did. These are people who are risking their own careers and their livelihoods to get word out, feeling that that's what it is to be patriotic.
So, for example, you had James Clapper openly lying to Congress.
You notice that these officials like James Clapper are not sworn in before they testify, which is very interesting.
That is interesting.
But yes, you watch him lying before Congress. Media is very careful not to say, often they won't say lie, but, if it's a kid who's lying, we know what to say. And I don't know why an official would be any different, as he is, he's asked whether the government is spying on the American people, and he says no. Now he says he misspoke.
Right, of course. But I wonder how you account for, I know people who are very intelligent, who I love and respect, who are thoughtful, educated, informed people, who just did not have the level of outrage that I felt was warranted by these disclosures from Edward Snowden and the stories by Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras. How do you account for it? Now, I might be going a little bit beyond your realm of expertise and asking for your personal opinion, but how do you account for that lack of outrage in America? Or is it simply that I didn't hear about it because it's not going to be covered by the media?
I think if people are not outraged, it's just because they don't know, and that's not necessarily their fault. Mm-hmm. The media doesn't cover the details of what is being revealed, except for places like Democracy Now! Look, when Glenn Greenwald came back with his very important book, No Place to Hide, about mm-hmm. Edward Snowden, surveillance in the national security state, he did his exclusive, the first interview with the Today Show, on NBC in the morning with Matt Lauer. And I think he was on for like 5 minutes. And then Matt Lauer said, "Back to the Muppets." No, I'm not kidding. Like, that wasn't my joke. That's what he said, because they were interviewing the Muppets afterwards, and I think before as well. Actually, I like the Muppets, and
I do too.
But I'm concerned about the puppets that we have on all the networks, the other puppets, not the ones who at least admit they're puppets,
right.
But or that we acknowledge as puppets. Mm-hmm. You have to ask, if we had state media in this country, how would it be any different? It wasn't just the pundits and the politicians who were saying that Glenn Greenwald, Edward Snowden should go to jail. It was journalists raising these issues as well. And Glenn Greenwald was fierce in responding to them, like, guys, this is our job. Stop pandering to those in power. We're not there to win a popularity contest. We're there to be the fourth estate, not for the state. Mm-hmm. To cover power, not cover for power. And to cover the movements that create static. Static, the dictionary definition of static: criticism, opposition, unwanted interference. That's our job.
Well, and also I like what you said at the very top of the interview about, how you guys at Democracy Now! Really strive to tell the stories of people who might not otherwise be heard. And it seems to me, politicians, wealthy individuals in the country, I mean, these people have outlets to tell their stories. And one of the greatest roles that journalists can do, I think, and I wonder if you agree with this, is tell the stories of average, everyday working citizens.
That's right, of citizens and non-citizens.
That's right.
Since there is such an important movement in this country around immigration, around documented and undocumented immigrants in this country. That's our job in journalism. And I have always said that I believe the media can be the greatest force for peace on earth. Why? Because when you hear someone speaking from their own experience, whether it's a Palestinian child, and you may have heard that the Pope referred to Palestine, by the way, when he went to Bethlehem. But whether you hear a Palestinian child or an Israeli grandmother, an uncle in Afghanistan, where it's just been announced, by the way, that the U.S. troops will not be pulled out at the end of this year, but 2016. And I remember raising questions when it was announced it would be the end of 2014, by the way, Eric, and, the media saying, don't be cynical, don't be. But, all indications were that there were going to be thousands upon thousands of soldiers who would remain, and now President Obama is simply admitting that. But whether it's a Palestinian child or an Afghan uncle or a woman in Iraq or a victim of a drone strike in Yemen, when you hear someone describing their own experience, there is nothing more powerful. I pitch on many stations, including WMPG, meaning, raise money for stations to ensure that they continue, because backroom deals aren't made with the weapons manufacturers and the oil, gas, and coal companies to support the programming, but simply turning to listeners and viewers who are deeply concerned about getting independent information, which is the oxygen of a society. But I pitch on a lot of stations around the country, television and radio, and one of those stations is Pacifica radio station, KPFT in Houston. It went on the air 44 years ago, and it's a historic station because it's the only one that was blown up by the Ku Klux Klan. Blown up, the transmitter, in the first weeks of operation. They strapped dynamite to the base of the transmitter and blew it to smithereens. When KPFT, the Houston station, got back on their feet, they blew it up again with dynamite 5 times the power.
When did this happen?
This happened in the spring of 1970, 44 years ago. And when they got back on their feet the second time, months later, and they were going back on the air, it was now a national event. I mean, when the Klan blew it up the second time, they blew it up in the middle of Arlo Guthrie singing Alice's Restaurant. So when they got back on their feet again and they were going on the air, Arlo flew into Houston, and he finished singing Alice's Restaurant on the new station, or the station with a newly rebuilt transmitter. And PBS, I think, ran that first broadcast, covered that first broadcast. Now, I don't remember if it was the Exalted Cyclops or the Grand Dragon, because I often confuse their titles, but he said it was his proudest act because he understood how dangerous Pacifica and all independent media is. Dangerous because it allows people to speak for themselves. And when you hear someone speaking from their own experience, it breaks down caricatures and stereotypes that fuel the hate groups. That's why the media can be so powerful as a means of opening up lines of communication, not only with people around the world, but people who live in different worlds in this country. There is such a huge divide. That's why I think the media can be the greatest force for peace on earth. Because where there is understanding, and I don't mean that we have to agree with each other, but understanding, where there is common ground, that's the beginning of peace.
Absolutely. I think, if you look at what we're sort of facing in this country, is people are becoming more and more atomized and polarized, and so much of media seems designed, I don't know if it's conscious or not, but designed to draw these arbitrary lines between groups of people that keep them separated and thus keep them disempowered. And I couldn't agree more that journalism could serve as a powerful force for solidarity and
a great equalizing force.
Absolutely.
Eric, I'm going to have to leave because, well, if I don't leave, we're not going to have a show for tomorrow. So we every day, these shows aren't planned weeks and months in advance. We plan a show and then something breaks and we have to disinvite guests and invite other ones. But I have to get on with working with the remarkable brain trust of producers and videographers who make Democracy Now! Happen every day.
Well, I thank you so much, Amy. This has really been a thrill and an honor, and I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Well, thanks so much, Eric, for taking the time.
Okay, thanks, Amy.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.